Hello, today's video will be a review of the Redmi 10 2022 model. As far as I can tell from specifications and from my experience of using it, of course, for a very short while, I can clearly say that this is an affordable mid-range phone. It has some good features and of course it has some bad ones, but overall I would say that it's quite a good model considering its price. I should start by saying what is the current market price of this phone. I think that it goes around 200 euros or US dollars, which I think is quite good amount considering what you are getting. Alright, let's talk about specifications. You have quite a large screen, a 6.5 inches screen, which is a good aspect nonetheless. You can clearly say that the amount of RAM is not very high, but on the other hand, it's not bad in itself. 4 gigabytes of RAM, it's fairly alright. 64 gigabytes of ROM, this is actually a poor way of presenting the storage space because it's not read-only memory, it's actually storage which is non-volatile memory, but anyway, it doesn't matter too much. What else we can find? The color is not important ultimately. What else you may be interested besides the screen, which is quite large, is the screen's type and resolution. It's a 6.5 inches screen, so it's quite large, and this means that the experience of using the phone should be quite modern despite its affordable price. The phone itself has quite a good build quality. I don't think there is much that can be said about it as not being affordable or not being decent enough. And it looks something like this. It's an LCD panel, so you shouldn't expect too much from it in terms of contrast, but I think it does the job pretty well. This is not the full brightness. The full brightness can be increased and it can get, from my point of view, quite decent for outdoor applications, and this in general is one of the important features of LCD screens. And as far as I can tell, the blacks are not overly brightened, so the contrast seems to be all right, at least for what I could assess. The resolution is 180 or 1080 by 2400 pixels, so it's quite a high resolution screen, and this means that you will have quite a pleasant experience of using the phone. There is also a cutout for the main camera, so you have almost the whole phone's body available to see the screen. So this means that it's quite a good screen, and the fact that it's so large is a major advantage. What is also important despite the screen, because this is the most important part with which you're going to interact the most, is the fact that it's a 90 Hertz screen, which means that it has a higher refresh rate than is typically available in phones, or at least in phones that are in a similar price range. Generally, you have your run-of-the-mill 60 Hz refresh rate, which is fine, but of course more modern applications, particularly games, could be making a better use of higher refresh rates. Of course, if the graphics chipset is at the necessary performance. Other than that, in terms of specifications, as mentioned, is a 4 GB RAM modules, a 4 GB model. So it's not too much, but it's decent considering the basic applications you may run and of course the basic experience for the device. In general, it would be better to have around 6 GB of memory with Android, but 4 GB is all right, at least for the moment, particularly in this price range. I mean, you have to understand again that using a phone that is costing less than 200 euros or around this price, with these specifications, it's not bad at all. In terms of specifications for the processor, I think that this is the first part that is going to be slightly low compared with other models, but of course it's typical in this price range. You have an Octa-core Cortex A75 with 2 cores at 2 GHz and 6 cores at 1.8 GHz. That those are being the efficiency cores, the Cortex A55. So you don't have a highly powered solution, and the graphics processor is being provided by the Mali G52. Overall, the chipset being made by Mediatek already tells you that this is a lower end offering. In general, when you strive for much better performance, you either have a Samsung Exynos or a Qualcomm Snapdragon. Of course, there are differences between chipsets, and there are some that are already obsolete, which doesn't make any sort of provision in case you are thinking about having a particular chipset. But in general, Qualcomm's the integrators of Qualcomm Snapdragon chipsets strive to have a better performance. This is not the case. It's ultimately a lower mid-range phone or an affordable mid-range phone, which means that performance is not going to be that critical. But what matters the more, much more for a phone of this range, on this range, despite the relatively economy aspects, is the fact that it still has a micro SD slot. So you can usually very easily increase the amount of storage beyond the 64 gigabytes, which means that this is not going to be an issue you're going to face most of the time with storage. 64 gigabytes is all right for the operating system, and if you want to store movies, files, or anything else on your phone, you can easily expand the storage probably up until 1 terabyte or as much as you would like, considering what kind of SD cards are available. Next down the line, I would say that the camera is your probably most important part when you set aside the screen and the basic functionality, because the camera is most likely the part that is going to be used the most. In terms of camera capabilities, you have to understand first of all that this is an economy phone. It doesn't fare bad. If you look closely, you're going to notice that the refresh in the camera application is fine, which means that you can have quite a good ability to see quickly what you're doing and make the necessary settings when you are in the photo range. However, as you notice in this situation, there is a problem with focusing. Of course, you may be thinking about this as not being an essential issue, because most likely you're not going to make attempts at focusing at such close range. And in general, you are not going to have situations that place the phone in such a condition where surfaces that are at an angle should be focused upon. So I don't think this one is a major issue. Next, I would say that focusing is quite alright, and low light performance is not bad, and I will exemplify this with my limited means. So if you look closely at the picture I made, you can see when you're looking at the edges of my finger that there is no contrast enhancement, or at least not one that is annoying. Although you can clearly notice noise, I don't think that, as now it's in focus, although you can clearly notice noise on these surfaces, which is due to the camera's low light performance that may not be particularly stellar, I think that it still does a good job of covering most of the aspects that you would like in a picture. And probably if I were to force focusing on a particular part, I think that the picture is going to be quite good. Sorry. And let's see the result. Yes, overall, although you could say that there are clearly much better cameras, I don't think the result is bad. And I'm not assuming the covering large distances, I mean making panoramas or other kind of photos where you want to have a wide angle are going to face issues. So for a phone in this range, again, nothing to complain about. I think that this is one of the highlights of this phone, despite its relatively tame camera specifications. The main camera is only probably around 10 megapixels. I'm not entirely sure if this is the situations. There are three cameras. There is a wide, there is an ultra wide, a macro, and a depth camera. I can probably have some sort of test to cover this if okay, so I think right now I covered, I think this one might be the main camera. Yes, clearly this one is the main camera. So the main camera is the one in the center. This is the flashlight. And the camera in the center, through specifications, I'm not entirely sure, but probably it's 50 megapixel camera. But I'm not entirely sure if this is the real resolution of the camera sensor or it's an interpolated resolution. So you don't have to take this one too seriously. The ultra-wide camera, which I think is, yes, it's the one on the top, is only 8 megapixels, so slightly lower than other phone models, and the macro and the depth one are only at 2 megapixels, so they have, I would say, decent quality despite their small sensor resolutions. So I would say that the camera performance of this model is quite good despite its price, and I'm not expecting the video performance to be bad, although I'm not expecting anything spectacular in this sense. I mean, probably a full HD video capturing at around 40 frames per second with nothing that could be particularly fabulous. Let's see. Yes. I think that the sound capturing was quite alright, and the video quality was decent. Nothing particularly surprising, but I think that it was good enough. And if I'm looking closely at motion compensation, I think that it's alright for this model. So video and camera performance are good for this model. Again, we have to think about the price. It's not an upper mid-range, it's not a top-of-the-line model, it's just an affordable mid-range phone. So you should have this in mind. In terms of other abilities, I should say that one of my biggest complaints I would have about this phone, and I think that this one should be covered immediately despite my attempts at not thinking about it too much, is the interface. I think that it's slightly clumsy in terms of the way it looks and works. We have become so much accustomed to phones that have notifications on the same screen as the quick shortcuts. And I think that leaving this space available when there are no quick comments placed on the screen is just a poor design choice. I would have expected notifications to be seen in the lower part of the screen, and of course to have some sort of control so that the upper parts of the screen would not take that much space. But having notifications visible only on this secondary page without any sort of indication that this is the case, I think is a very poor design choice. There are other design choices that I think also fare quite bad on this model, and the one that comes to mind the quickest is the fact that I could not find a way to increase the time until the screen is turned off. And from my point of view, the experience of using a phone with a timeout that is fixed by the manufacturer is a very poor design choice. When you're trying to use your mobile phone as a very small computer, having it keep the brightness for at least a couple of minutes is a drawback that I would like to have in terms of usability. However, I have not been able to find this ability, and I will show you just where I found some settings, but not this one. So in display, brightness level, reading mode, color scheme, refresh rate, of course it's placed at 60. It could have been placed at 90 and I think it works pretty well. However, I don't think it's a good choice when you're trying to make the battery last as long as possible. However, for testing purposes, I think for benchmarking purposes it's going to be alright. You can see that screen animations are quite smooth, so this goes on to show that there is a good way of balancing the hardware with the software performance. Again, for a model that is not overly expensive. And if you're looking at battery, which probably could have these additional settings, you can clearly notice that there doesn't seem to be such an option. Okay, battery saver, battery drain indication. So nothing that, as far as I can tell, could be pertaining to screen settings, which from my point of view is a bad choice in terms of usability, but could be okay for the demographic that is most likely targeted by this phone. Another gripe I have in terms of abilities is the fact that the applications that are being supplied with the phone are in many ways inferior to the ones offered by Samsung or Huawei. And I think that the visual design language is slightly unpleasant in some ways, although with other users or to other users, I don't think this is going to be an issue. But from my point of view, the way in which the interface is being organized still leaves a lot to be desired. You have a lot of applications that of course are being bundled with the phone, and if you want to see a major factor that distinguishes this model from others on the market, I think that it's the ability to have 4 or 5 games, I think 5 games out of the box installed on the mobile phone. So if you think about the out of box experience in terms of gaming, it's not going to be disappointing. It's the typical kind of puzzle games collection, so you're not going to have actions games or anything else that could be too much for the phone to handle, but it's good to know. The rest of the application suite is quite alright. It's the typical one you may consider. You can probably open Office documents and others using the VPS Office suite. And you have other applications for handling your notes and QR coding, scanning, as well as your other requirements regarding a browser and so on, voice recorder and others. So it's not bad in itself, but again, nothing to write home about. The next aspect I think that will be quite interesting is to see how the phone handles some benchmarks. Right. And in terms of specifications, I think that I should have cancelled this benchmark. Alright, these are the specifications. I hope you can see them quite clearly on the camera. You still have some memory available after you run the basic application suite of around 1 GB, so I think it's not bad in itself. The battery and charging performance, I should have also mentioned that. The battery being supplied is a 5000 milliamp hour, which is quite large for a phone of this size, when some similar models have just 4000 or 4700 milliamp hours, which could probably translate to at least 8 or 10 hours of intense use, considering the fact that the screen itself doesn't draw too much current, and the chipset is quite low on performance and thus power requirements. And however, since it's a 12 nanometer chipset, I think it could have had much better performance if it were built with more modern process manufacturing. Sorry. All right, so let's see the benchmarks, because this is going to be the part that is much more interesting to look at. And of course, cover my final assessments about the model. I'm not expecting a stellar performance, because ultimately this is not high-end model. I'm expecting decent one. The one I'm mostly concerned with is going to be the graphics performance and slightly the storage performance test, because storage is going to degrade as the phone gets older, and the 3D graphics tests are in general quite demanding, and some of them show very well if the graphics chipset is already obsolete or not. I think that the screen of timeout is still annoying in this situation, and I have covered that before, but you can clearly see that there are use scenarios where this is even more annoying. More than 1000 megabytes per second memory read, I think is a decent performance in this situation. I can't say too much about this test because you have to understand the fact that so many phones employ different ways in which they set the phone's performance based on particular profiles. So this information has to be taken with a lot of variation in consideration. I think that what matters the most is how low the performance gets in particular situations, and the storage performance, because these are two major tests where it's very hard to make it seem like the phone is operating fast when it doesn't. More than 100 megabytes per second, I think it's a decent performance. Of course, it would have been 500 megabytes, but it doesn't matter too much. Again, we are not talking about a top-end model, and I think that the performance consistency is much more important in this respect. The 2D graphics sets tests seem to run quite alright, not very fast, but I think that this is not an issue. Particularly, you can see in the image rotation and other effects part of the test that the performance is not very high, but I think it's decent. Of course, we are not talking about the performance mode, we are talking about the general setting. 52, 27, I think it's decent in this case, and of course performance drops to less than 14 frames per second when the screen is split in so many ways, which was probably expected with this graphics chipset. And we got onto the 3D tests, 70 frames per second, so quite a good performance, I would say, but the level of details is not particularly high. But it drops clearly below the 90 frames per second. This is actually one of the major reasons I do not quite recommend using the 19 Hz screen option, because in games you are probably not likely going to see this improvement as much as you consider. So having a stable 60 frames per second is much more important. And as you can see in these demanding titles, the Mediatek Mali graphics chipset is actually having quite a poor performance. So less than 20 frames per second tells a lot about how much the graphics chipset is obsolete. But if you're running just puzzle games and you're not thinking about demanding titles, I think it's alright. We will also see another application running, and this one is going to be Google Earth, so that you can have a good assessment of the graphics performance and how much it impacts at least the current performance in quite alright use scenarios. I mean that use scenarios that are decent and well thought of. Right, I think that the performance is quite clearly visible over here. As I mentioned in other situations, I think that my biggest gripe with this benchmark is the fact that it doesn't have any sort of mention in terms of the lowest frame rate and the highest one, so that you can see the spread and how good or bad a job of handling 3D graphics the graphics chipset does. But this is the situation. And the 2D graphics test was decent, although I have noticed some image manipulation simulations as being very low. And in terms of the processor performance, it can ramp up and down quite well. I don't think there is a problem from 500 to 1.8 500 megahertz to 1.8 gigahertz for the economic or energy efficiency cores, and from 850 to 2 gigahertz for 850 megahertz to 2 gigahertz for the performance cores. So not bad, but again, not a stellar performance. and you have almost 37 gigabytes of storage after you install some basic applications. So I don't think you're going to see immediately the issue with this phone storage, and if more performance is required, you can easily update it using the SD card. And I think that we should also see the performance in some tests, and in this case I think that speed test is a good assessment in terms of performance. We are having Wi-Fi 6 networking over here, and it's connected to gigabit port later down the line, so I don't think the performance is going to be bad. Probably around 300 to 500 megabytes a second with a very low ping is going to be the likely performance. Yes, quite close to the 300 megabits per second mark, so not bad. Clearly not the best, but clearly not bad. Alright, and the next one, the next test I would like to show you is in Google Earth, and we are going, as you have also seen in other videos, towards London, because it's quite a densely packed city, and it's quite well represented in terms of 3D modeling. So let's see. Quite a good time in terms of screen refreshes, and let's zoom in and change the angle and see how smoothly the rotation can be handled. Not bad, but as you have noticed, screen refreshes take quite a bit of time. So the performance is not particularly great, at least as far as networking, and you have noticed that. On the other hand, the processing is decently fast because the movement is not overly jagged. And of course we are using the 19 Hz settings, so, and we are clearly going at a lower frame rate than this. So I assume that if I'm going to the classical 60 Hz setting, it's going to look a bit smoother. So let's see, where is that? Okay, setting it again to 60 Hz. And getting back to the application, there is a slight improvement in terms of screen updates, because the frame rate could be a little bit more stable, which I think is important, because ultimately you're looking for consistency, not particularly the top performance you may have. So overall, not bad, but again, I have seen much better performance in Google Earth for other models, but of course, not particularly at this price range. So I'm not entirely sure if other models will be better or worse, but clearly this one doesn't fare as bad as you would consider. And I think this is important. On the phone side, you can see the power on off button, the volume control, and on the other side you can see the indentation that takes out the tray holding the SIM card and the SD card. And on the lower side you have clearly the USB-C power port, which is standard, a speaker grill, I think. Could be a ventilation hole, but I think it's mostly a speaker grill, and the lower microphone. Just as well on the other side you can see again another speaker grill and the additional microphone port. Right, so overall not a bad performance. One other aspect I should have covered in terms of battery is also pertaining to the charger. I still think that it's good when a phone comes with a charger, particularly when it has a slightly better performance or a slightly better power capacity or capability compared with others. And in this case, providing a charger for 18 watts, which is slightly higher than your typical fast charger that most likely uses the 5 watts, the 15 watts power range, I think is a good design choice. And of course, the fact that you can change the USB cable, I think is an environmental friendly approach that has been used by most manufacturers, and I still think that it's one of the best choices in this situation, just as well as the single power and data port, that is the USB-C, which covers all your basic needs. In terms of charging, I think that in around an hour you can go from an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. So 70 to 80 minutes, you can get from 0 to about 80% charging, perhaps even faster. I have not timed that one particularly, but I think it's fine. The charger doesn't get overly warm to the touch, which means that it will probably have a good lifetime. On the other hand, the phone can get hotter when charging. However, if I'm thinking about how hot the phone gets after our benchmark, well, it's just a bit warm to the touch. So this means that the phone itself probably will have quite a good performance, and it deserves this praise, because there are situations where you like to have a phone that has a good battery life, and on the other hand, you don't need all the performance. And for some users, those are already good enough reasons to purchase. And in terms of other features you have, it's your typical manual with a very interesting additional choice. You also have a cover that comes with your phone. I think this is a very good choice, and a welcome one, not the least, because in general you have to supply at least some sort of protection for your phone, and this one will clearly increase the phone's ability to withstand the shocks and have less chance of ending up in service quickly. So I think this one is a good design choice, and it doesn't create too much bulk in the package, and I think that some users may clearly appreciate such a solution being provided out of the box. And I think this one is clearly a very wise one, also considering the demographic, but not only that. If you're going to use or not this cover probably depends on your expectations. Alright, and let's see. Yes, you have your typical tray that could probably hold a single SIM card and one SD card. So it's not a dual SIM module. And ones that do have this capability in general have it only in certain situations. So you can use either the additional slot or the or two SIMs, but in this case it's not the case. Alright, so overall I think that this model is quite alright, has good specifications and performance for its price, and some pleasant surprises in terms of the fast charging capability and the cover that is being supplied. I think it leaves a little to be desired in terms of the graphics interface, and I still think that this one is the biggest letdown of the package. Other than that, the LCD screen is good, at least considering the price. The camera performance is quite alright, perhaps not the best in terms of its video recording capabilities, because you have only Full HD and that's it. And what else can I say? The specifications for memory, chipset are not bad, although clearly far from what your typical 2022 mid-range model would provide. But again, we are talking about an economy or a value mid-range model, which means that those expectations had to be set aside. So for 200 euros, I think it's a good model, and probably you can find it even cheaper than that. But it's a solid performer for this price. And considering some possibilities of it being available at 150, even makes the prospect even nicer. So quite a good model, again, not a top of the line, not a mid-range one, but an economy mid-range, or more likely a value proposition, but one that is solid, meaning that the corners being cut or other ways in which the product ended up at a particular price point is not in a way that affects severely usability. And my only gripes about the graphics interface, of course, can be considered in this context, but are the ones that are the easiest to improve. With just a few changes in the software, I think that it would provide much better performance and joy for the persons that are using it. And I also have to have another mention about updates. I think that they are somewhat slower than on other phones in terms of the amount of time it takes for an update to be installed, and considering also the fact that the phone is being released in 2022, I still think that it has more update packages than it should have had. So I think that there were 4 update packages that have to be installed out of the box, and you had to spend a lot of time waiting for the phone to finish those updates. Of course, other phones also have this issue, but I think that 1 or 2 updates may be what I was expecting. So having 4 updates and those being quite small, just for a few months, I still think it detracts a bit from the experience of using the phone out of the box and trying to enjoy it. But overall, again, not a bad model. I think that the software and the way in which the software is being handled may be less to my liking. But other than that, good hardware, good camera, good specifications, and particularly battery and charging for a phone in this range. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.